Hello, and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And today we're talking about Corsage, which is a period drama set in the life of Empress Elisabeth of Austria. And you were telling me before, you said to me, do you know anything about this film? I said, well, I'd heard this, and I'd seen some comparisons with Marie Antoinette, directed by Sofia Coppola in 2006.
The films are nothing alike.
I didn't know very much, though, about it, and I don't think I'd heard particularly of Sisi. So now
yes, and I was telling you that this is maybe, one of the many, many ways in which kind of British culture is unaware and uninvolved with, continental European culture, because I think across Europe, people of my generation, and actually maybe even people 30 and 40 years younger, have grown up with the Sissi films. They were like a kind of a sociological phenomenon. They were like a type of Disney thing, or The Wizard of Oz or something like that. They were on TV all the time, and everybody grew up with them. They start a teenage Romy Schneider. It's the films that made her a huge star. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Romy Schneider reprised the role for Visconti's Ludwig from the early 1970s, with Helmut Berger playing Ludwig, who also appears in Corsage, the character, the king of Bavaria, Ludwig, not Helmut Berger, obviously. And of course, and there's also a Netflix television series, which I kind of tried and didn't get on with, and I let it. So she's just kind of an iconic figure across the continent. If you go to Vienna, everything is Sissi, right? Yeah. I went there with Nikki. We went to Hofburg Palace, which is, one of the locations for the film. And, she's someone who is seen as very stylish and very elegant and very modern and kind of lonely and sad and so on. So she's kind of an iconic figure, an endless, source of fascination to some, including me.
Yeah. She was Empress of Austria and also Queen of Hungary when the dual kingdom of Austria-Hungary came into being in 1867. This film is set 10 years after that, on her 40th birthday. It starts on her 40th birthday in 1877, and then we essentially see a year of her life. And it's a year in which she's someone for whom beauty is very important, and the way in which she's seen is very important. Her job, essentially, is to bear heirs to the throne and be seen.
Yeah, to represent.
And hitting 40, that's, both parts come into focus. She says at one point, I'm too old for another child. And the focus on how she's seen, her beauty, what she thinks of how she's seen, and that sort of thing, it's constant throughout the film. It's changing as she gets older. She's no longer 20.
Well, there's a line where she says that everything begins to disappear or dissolve after 40. Yeah, that kind of... And there's another line which says, the average age of death in your kingdom is 40.
Yes.
Yeah, so women's average... The age at which the average woman in the Austro-Hungarian Empire died was 40 in that period.
Yeah, so the doctor tells her that as one of his reassuring... Yes. He's constantly telling her things like, you should be grateful. She's trying to kill herself. Spoiler, I guess. She tries to kill herself at one point, and she winds up with nothing more than a hairline fracture of her calf, I think. And the doctor says, your good health should be a sign from God of how much he favours you, something along those lines. Yes. And of course, that's not how she sees it. She just tried to kill herself. He's kind of... I suppose he's... To an extent, he's kind of comic relief, because he's kind of out of touch and not getting the point. Whereas we know her much more intimately than... He apparently does, because we're following her around for 2 hours. We know how she thinks.
I really like the film. Everything feels chilly. Everything seems spied upon or seen through a window. There's that recurring image of that empty courtyard in the palace where people leave, basically. You rarely see people coming. So, she's a bulimic. She's constantly weighing herself, eating very little. She's got nothing to do. The title of the film is Corsage, which I initially didn't get, but I looked it up, and basically it means corset. Yeah, it's a German word for corset, right? And again, there are all these, images of her being corseted in, and she asks for it always to be tighter, right? So, a corset is something that kind of restricts you, keep you in place, is kind of shapes you and so on, gives a particular appearance, but also like prevents you from breathing and
Corsage is also kind of a floral sort of display that like something that a woman wears and again and that's kind of a beauty related thing. It's to show her off too.
Yes, I know, but my understanding from just looking it up is that corsage is literally corset in German.
Yeah, and this is a German, Austrian, Luxembourgish, French co-production, and there's a lot of companies involved and a lot of languages being spoken as well. So, but I think it's interesting that it also has that meaning.
Yeah.
In
it
English,
can also mean that, so it can be read in that way. But though it's interesting, because as the film unfolds and she gets less and less happy and more troubled, and she begins to take heroin, and it means she can't perform her duties. She gets her lady in waiting to pretend that she's her for this occasion, and then ironically her daughter does a picture of the event saying, this is as poised as you were really poised, whilst doing this. I was very proud of you or something. It was very fitting. So she's a woman who's constantly being judged on how she looks, on her hair, which she then cuts off, on what is fitting and what is not fitting. Her husband and her son kind of decide on all of those things. And yet she's ostensibly the most powerful woman in the kingdom. So kind of there is a real feminist thesis behind all of this, which I think is lovely to see. So she's always surrounded by women. She talks to women, and the film doesn't sentimentalize it. She often treats her mates quite poorly, right? So she's not necessarily like, a goody-goody person or anything. She's suffering, but you get a sense of kind of a complex set of relationships, including her relationship with her husband, which she clearly has affection for, though, clearly, they're not quite getting on. The scene where she unveils her body, I thought was amazing. I thought it was so powerful. And then when she clearly wants to have sex, but when she says that she doesn't want any more children, it's like the whole thing kind of dissolves. So I really loved all of that. And the most amazing thing for me in the film was Vicky Krieps, who I just think, people often talk about how, the camera loves some people and it doesn't love others. And it has nothing to do with beauty necessarily, because some very unattractive people, you can't take your eyes off them, right? As G. Robinson or people like that. But in this, she's both extraordinarily beautiful, I find, and also riveting. You can't stop looking at her, and she's always kind of legible, even in the opaqueness, even what is meant to be conveyed as contradictory or opaque, or, and I just loved looking at her. I thought, to me, she was the surprise of Phantom Thread. I don't think I'd seen her.
It was the first a lot of people had heard of
it. And she was fantastic in that. And I could really tell why she wanted to play this role. She's a producer in it.
Yeah, I believe she was the one who brought the idea to the director, and this film's directed by Marie Kreutzer, written and directed. And I think they had worked together on something before that, again, I don't think it's been seen very much. Because I was reading that the early life of the Empress has been dramatised quite a bit, and the end of her life as well. She was assassinated, and that's interesting. But they were looking at this coming into middle age kind of period, which I guess no one had. At least they had the impression no one had really shown much interest in this before, but there was something interesting to be found in it.
Well, I think they've certainly made something interesting about it. About women and their representation, and their power and their voice or lack thereof, and how age kind of incurs a loss of social value, which is tied to how women are really kind of valued largely on their looks. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a more general point to make about that. I think kind of age has that effect on people at all. I certainly felt that at a certain point I became invisible. That kind of you'd walk down the street and nobody saw you. And I think that has to do with age in general. So I don't think it's just something that women suffer from, though obviously women suffer from it more and in different and particular ways. And I think the film kind of really conveys that, I think, quite powerfully, really.
Well, I didn't get on with it at all.
I know. Tell me about
begging for it to end. There's not a lot to say, really, because I kind of appreciate everything that you're saying. I'm glad that you liked it so much. I found so much of it kind of really one note. Like, I can see what you like about Vicky Krieps' performance. I wasn't interested in this woman. I spent so much of the film going, she's just in a mood all the time. I felt bad for all of her sort of footmen waiting on her all the time, just having to stand in rooms watching her mope. What a life. I thought this is completely plotless. But that's okay for a film to have very little plot. But then the character, the situation, none of it was replacing that, giving me anything to grab onto. I felt like it didn't say anything that surprised me or showed was insightful. Everything seemed so obvious.
I didn't think so.
And I kind of thought that when sometimes people say like, "Oh, I hate foreign films, I hate subtitle films," and very often you can just dismiss that because they don't really know what they're talking about. But I kind of feel like this is the kind of film that they're talking about, or they think they're talking about when they say that. A lot of silences, a lot of people walking into rooms and having very boring conversations, people looking through windows, feeling dispossessed. I really didn't get on with it.
I did. I liked it. I thought it created like this really wonderful, wintry, sad, foggy mood.
Do you think it was beautiful?
No. I think kind of a lot more could have... I mean, I don't think it's a great film. Don't get me wrong. I think a lot more could have been done visually. Whereas Sofia Coppola's use of the anachronistic was exciting. Yeah, and I loved her use of pop music, and it made it lively, and it made it into a teen film and so on. I thought this just really took me out of the film. When they started singing Help Me Make It Through the Night in that fake folk kind of...
Yeah, they do it in the style of the time.
Yeah, it was like, oh, please, that was terrible. Terrible choices. And As Tears Go By was another one. And then also just, that so much of the score is actually a woman singing pop music, which, I mean, I quite liked it. But it just was really disorientating to me, when it came on, So I didn't like any of that.
It didn't seem consistent because there were things that I noticed occasionally, but not consistently enough that I pieced it together as something the film was doing or making something out of. Because then later on, or right towards the end, she gets on a boat. And I said to you, this boats didn't look like this at the time. And obviously I hadn't put together that the film had been doing bits and bobs. Because when I think back, they'd been fencing with modern equipment. And not only with that, but in a room which had an illuminated exit sign. So like it's complete now. But I did notice electric lights at one point, electric candles. And again, it's not hidden. They're right in the middle of the frame. And I did notice them and I went, did they have those then?
Well, there were weird...
But it's not building anything consistent out of it, and I couldn't quite understand why it was doing.
Well, there were weird choices, right? So, the palace, Hofburg Palace, is very interesting because it's a little bit like the rooms not visible to tourists must look like now. They're all empty. They're empty of hangings. They're empty of paintings. You see chairs piled up just in front of the Empress's bedroom. Now, you cannot imagine that to have been the case in 1878. No way. Right? And also, King Ludwig's palace, he was famous for having everything over-decorated and camp and gold and chandeliers and turrets, and he would never have slept in a bedroom like that, that it looked like, the plaster was falling and, so I think they were maybe giving the impression of something being built, but it looked like something in the middle of a ruin.
Do you think maybe there's a budgetary thing? Because the film is cheap. Well, cheap, I mean, that's a bit unfair, but it's low budget, relatively, €8 million. So I kind of feel like when she gets on that ferry at the end, it's much easier to rent a ferry from 2020 than it is to get an odd steamship.
Sure.
And maybe that kind of informs some
No,
of
but
this.
I think there was something that was an aesthetic choice about it, the sense of temporariness, of decay, of, things fading and being lost, and so
it does have a relationship to her state of mind.
Yeah. But nonetheless, it felt not fully realized to me. And of course, the surprising things was the use of cinema. I mean, and I'm sure I should be shot down for this, but was cinema invented in 1878?
It was very early days. That character, was he... I don't think he was... Is he an imagined character, this guy who is introducing cinema?
Well, I don't know because I didn't catch the name.
He's... But he's not Edward Muybridge, is he? He's French or one thing. Yeah. And obviously, France did have.
But even those, I think Edison and the Lumieres and
that's Lumiere. He's not a Lumiere brother.
They were all in at least the 80s and the 90s, right?
Yeah, it's 1890s is when
exactly
cinema
1895. Started. So this felt like, what is the point of that, of being captured, of. So there's like whole discussion about paintings and photography and cinema, which it's both anachronistic and it also felt out of place. I mean, I suppose it has to do with representation, and she certainly makes sure that her painter idealizes her. And she says that, photography is not objective. Yeah. And of course, we know that about cinema as well. Yes, you can create idealized images of all kinds of things, but I suppose that ties into the themes of presentation and representation and, kind of not being valued for who you are. There, there's also that line in the film, that people are loved for what the one loving wants to see in them, rather than from whom they are. And there's another line in the film where she tells her lady in waiting, "You're the only one who loves me for who I am," right? So, kind of maybe all of those things kind of tie in together, but not as poetically or as seamlessly as I would have liked to see it. So, for me, it's not a great film, but I do think that it's very much worth seeing. I do think it's a feminist film. It has very interesting things to say, about women at 40. I do think that Vicky Krieps is like somebody like Garbo or Dietrich or something, that you read all these moods in their faces, right? And the film is much more variegated than you give it credit for, right? So you see her being very loving with her daughter and, and with her son and and being, impatient with her maids and cutting her sister off and, having this kind of fag-hag relationship with Ludwig, right? Fag-hag in quotation marks, don't sue me. So I think it's a really incredibly complex view of this woman. It's not just her being moody.
I think it's just variations on the theme that all comes from this woman who... I think the... one of the main reasons that people have been trying to compare it to Marie Antoinette is that it's about a woman who's kind of not giving a fuck, right, in this position of privilege and power and wealth, but still has she has this obligation and a role, and people trying to talk down her husband essentially seems to see her as a child, and she's kind of decided to not give a fuck. And the thing about here is that it's also kind of reaching 40, and with her beauty, she definitely kind of feels and knows that it's fading, or it's no longer what it was, despite the fact she's seeking kind of reassurance about it and so on. But she is, it's the thing people say when they get older, that people just stop giving a fuck and they start feeling more free. And I think women in particular say that. You talk about people kind of society rendering people invisible as they get older, and I think, as you say, women kind of feel that very keenly. And you do get women of, quote unquote, a certain age or middle age, whatever, saying it, that I think sometimes they feel it frees them up. I think that's kind of what you're seeing elements of in this character here. But basically what I'm saying is that every different way in which she interacts with someone or feels about someone is a variation on that central thing. Nothing surprised me about it. I didn't feel anything was too original or interesting about it. I felt like I knew what every scene was going to be, you know?
I didn't feel that way. And I thought it's one of those films that kind of grow cumulatively. Yeah, that like, you know, the sadness, the dissatisfaction, you know, kind of convey something slightly different and richer as the film unfolds. So you say she doesn't give a fuck, but of course she does. You know, if she didn't give a fuck, she wouldn't be eating a thin slice of orange a day, right? So she's obviously very keen on maintaining her figure, on maintaining, you know, but she is someone who really only responds to her children and her animals. So, you know, she's also a narcissist, yeah. But the unhappiness and the restrictions and her attempt to cut her hair, her attempt to find other types of interests, you know, and eventually I think you have to read that last scene as a kind of suicide, right? Yeah, she's
talked about it before, and when Ludwig says, "I forbid you from killing yourself in my lake," she says, "Well, I was thinking about the sea anyway," and of course now she's on the sea. It's been set up to some degree.
That's the last shot. So that's very interesting. So she finds her role so restrictive that she finds somebody else to take it over. She knows she won't be missed if the representation continues. She arranges for her husband, you know, to be with a nice woman who will be kind to him, right? And then she kills herself, right? Yeah, in 1978, instead of being shot by, an
Italian an Italian anarchist, yeah.
Yeah.
In 1898.
Yeah, 30 years later or 20 years later or something. So, you know, kind of the only agency that this woman in the highest position in the land has is to kill herself. But only after she's found a replacement, right? Like a double. I mean, I think it's very interesting, actually. And I think it's intellectually interesting. I'd like to think about it some more, right? And I think the film does set it up kind of, you know, in really interesting ways. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, but it doesn't sell it to me while I'm watching it. It doesn't. And you say, you know, it's not a great film, and visually so much more could be going on. I think it's a huge failure that it is so dull visually and so dull kind of tonally as well. Like, I get we're watching a depressed woman, but I feel like more can be happening in these scenes, or there could be some kind of spark or energy that is just missing. Well, you know, the conflict that she creates could be more interesting than it is, could be more exciting than it is.
I don't know. I mean, I think you're asking for a different film.
I guess I kind of am, but that's just what that's how it took me.
Because the longueurs, the sadness, the fog, the emptiness, the sparseness, that's what the film is about. So if you're not into any of those things, then you're not going to like this film.
It didn't get into me here. That's all I can say. You know, that's what it is. I mean, I spent most of the film thinking this is one of the more forgettable films I've seen this year. And, you know, 3 days before the end of the year, I found my least interesting film of the year.
That is not true.
But that's just fine. That's what it is. You know?
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting film. I'm very glad it's made. It's really, I think, if nothing else, you know, for Vicky Krieps' performance, I really think it's an extraordinary performance, really. And not just like, oh, what a good performance this week or this year, whatever. I mean, I think it is kind of a performance that should be legendary, really, in the years to come. So I think that's a reason to see it. And I also think we rarely, I mean, maybe never, but I can't think of an instance now. I'm sure there are some, you know, but you rarely get a woman's view on something like this. You know, an iconic figure on the verge of middle age and what that means, right? You know, so I think it's kind of interesting for all of these kinds of reasons, you know, and I would recommend, you know, that people see it, though with the proviso that it's not kind of Indiana Jones levels of excitement.
No. No, but it should be. That should all film.
All right. Well, thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter. And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
I think between us we came up with an accurate assessment.
Okay, yeah, well, for all the people who just couldn't really give a fuck, then you've got my side.
Yes.